Welcome, everyone. My name is Piper Hendricks, and I'm the CEO of Stories Change Power, and we're so glad that you're here. I hope that the song that our speaker selected put a smile on your face this Friday. I will introduce Christy in just a moment. First, I want to have a quick introduction of Stories Change Power in case you are new to this webinar series. You can think of us as the trainer for your civic muscle, meaning that being engaged in your neighborhood, your community, and your country, shaping policies and laws and everything around you that impacts you, your neighbors, and the world, to put it very bluntly. We are helping bridge divides that we see along many different lines, including political. We do that through advocacy strategy and, of course, as our name suggests, with storytelling, because we know that storytelling is a huge part of advocacy and bridging those divides. If that's of interest, we still have a few spaces and 2 courses that we're offering next month, Storytelling 101 and Ethical Storytelling, and we will pop that into the chat later. For now, a quick few reminders. We have captions enabled, so please use those if you'd like if they're helpful to you. This is a webinar, so you are off camera and off mic. You can make funny faces, you can still be in your pajamas, but if you want us to know what's on your mind, please use the chat. That chat is for humans only. Your AI is welcome to watch the recording. The chat will not be included in that recording, so please feel free to add your comments there. Where you have questions, please put those in the Q&A. There's a little box at the bottom of your screen. Just pop those there, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end of our session today. With that, it is an absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Christy Roschke, who is an associate research professor of communications and of science and technology, and the executive director of the McGee Applied Research Center for Narrative Studies at Vanderbilt University. Go Doors. As a media literacy researcher, she is interested in the way complex information systems impact how we view and understand the world. Her recent research has examined trust and transparency in the media, which I know is top of mind for everybody today. She's looked at health misinformation and media literacy education adoption and best practices. Christy is a member of the National Academy of Medicine's Communication Advisory Group, a board member for the National Association for Media Literacy Education, and a co-lead for the Task Force on Defeating Disinformation Attacks on U.S. Democracy that was convened by the McCain Institute and the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University. Welcome, Christy. We are so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Piper. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, all right. I just want to make sure I got a little unmute button on my screen. So I'm excited to be here with everyone today. So I'll go ahead and get started.
Yeah. Well, first, actually, before I hand it over to you, we have a poll that we always like to ask folks questions on the webinar to get a sense of who's here today. So that should be popping up in just a moment if it's not there already. We've got 3 questions today. The first, if you joined us in our last webinar, you'll see that this new one, we've tweaked just slightly. We're asking, how long have you been an advocate or used your civic muscle? And by that, we mean being engaged in your community. That may be through advocacy, which we define as work that changes laws and policies and systems. It may be being someone who's really promoting civic engagement. So however you define that, we'd love to hear how long that's been something that you've been doing. Our second question is, what is your platform of choice to get news and information? And this one is multiple choice. Am I saying that? Or you can pick multiple options. So pick as many are as applicable to you: television, radio, podcasts, news websites, social media, or other. If there's something that we missed, please pop that in the chat. We'd love to know what your platform of choice for getting news and information. And then the final question, we go back to just a single choice, is how certain are you that you can spot misinformation? We've got an option 100%, nothing false ever gets past me. 75%, this ain't my first rodeo, but there might be some clever things that I could miss. 50%, it's a coin toss, or not at all certain. Have you seen what AI can do these days? So I'm seeing a lot of responses coming in. If you're not able to put those into the poll, feel free to use the chat for that as well. We'll give folks a few more moments. I know 3 questions, you might be doing some thinking. Let's see. Got good responses coming in. A few more, give folks a few more moments here. Ah, this is interesting. I get a preview of the results. I'll share those in just a
I
moment.
can't wait.
Yeah. So let's give everybody maybe three, two. I don't want to cut you off. If we miss you, go ahead and put those answers in the chat. But with that, I will end here and share. So what you're going to be seeing, we've got a good number of folks who are brand new. Welcome. A good mix there of people who are advocates or new to using their civic muscle. Platform of choice, we see about 40% television, third radio, almost half podcasts. I'm with you on the podcast, 85% on news websites, 69% on social media, and then nobody in other. So interesting there. We've got it looks like just one person who says nothing false gets past me. So you'll have to share some of your tricks. 75%, we've got about 75% saying 75%. Most things they'll recognize, but some things may get past. And then a few folks saying it's a coin toss, and then some that aren't at all certain. So with Christy, with that gives a good sense of who we've got here. I'll stop sharing the poll and hand over to you for your presentation. And then as a reminder, folks, Q&A always welcome, and we'll have plenty of time for that at the end.
That's great. Thank you so much, Piper. And thanks for everyone for sharing those poll answers. That was really great context for this conversation. And I am going to go ahead and get started by sharing my screen. Let's see here, actually. All right. Sorry, I'm going to go backwards. Sorry, guys. I've started in the middle and now I'm not able to move. I apologize, guys. Here we go. Starting little snafu there. I apologize, but I'm here today to talk about the truth in the noise and how we can use media literacy for change makers in an age of misinformation. So as Piper mentioned, I'm Christy Raschke. I'm with Vanderbilt University, and I'm the executive director of the McGee Applied Research Center for Narrative Studies. And our mission is really to help people gain the essential skills and knowledge that they need to navigate this complicated media environment that we set up in the poll. And we do this in three main ways. We do this through a lot of research, but also collaborative education and community engagement. So our research is applied, everything that we learn sort of in our lab, we always want to make sure we can share with others because it really is a problem that affects everyone, as we learned. And I hope the person who feels like they're 100% great at spotting misinformation can share some of their tips because maybe they should be helping teach this today because it is pretty complicated. But once upon a time, it all seemed so simple. Back in the 20th century, as my tween son likes to tell me that I'm from the 20th century, our media use was pretty simple. We had a daily newspaper, maybe two. We had television news a few times a day, radio on the way to work. I mean, that was pretty much how we all got our information. And that information came from a few number of sources. So we were all pretty similarly informed, watching the same things, looking at the same things, having that water cooler talk. Those days are long over, and I know I don't need to tell this audience that, but just as a reminder and a bit of context, today when we think about the media landscape or when someone says something about the media, and I'll put that in air quotes, it can mean a bunch of different things. It can mean those good old 20th century outlets like professional journalism and newspapers, news websites, TV and radio, but it also can mean those newer formats, like a lot of you who are using podcasts, YouTube shows, different social media channels, like on Facebook and X. Certainly, it sounds like a lot of us in this group, and you're not alone, are using social media to get at least some of your news. But it also happens in closed groups and forums, and that's an increasingly popular place for people to stay informed through closed WhatsApp groups, Telegram, Reddit, even things like Discord and Twitch. When people are doing other things like gaming, they're still kind of engaging in current events in these closed groups. But also it means, through search and increasingly through chatbots, generative AI chatbots like on Google or ChatGPT. But the media landscape also includes individuals who maybe aren't tethered to an organization or who we engage with more on a social or a parasocial way. So that is professional reporters. Certainly, the vast majority of the content we consume today originates with professional reporters. But there's also a lot of punditry and analysis out there on television, certainly on social media, people who make a living sharing their thoughts about what's going on in the world. Which again, I know I don't need to tell all of you this, but that's a different process than reporting on what's going on throughout the world. an increasing number of independent journalists, influencers, content creators, especially on TikTok, but certainly Instagram and YouTube is very popular. But we can also be media when we witness events and we share those events, whether we share them with the world via social media, we share them with our family via text message. We are kind of engaging in that active content creation when we are a part of an event and we share it with others. And then just again, like chatting with the family or, your uncle or your old neighbor on Facebook who is sharing information. We are all kind of part of the media today. And so just wanted to say that not that this is new to anyone, but just to kind of set the context for how it can be a much more difficult conversation about what to do and how to make sure we're best informed when we have so many choices. This is research that comes from the Pew Research Center. If you're not familiar with their survey research, I'm guessing probably most of you are. They do great research on media, social media, digital use. They found that most people are seeing at least some news on the 4 major social media platforms, even if that's not the reason that they come to those platforms. And for most people, it's not the main reason. This little nugget from this survey I thought was particularly interesting, which is a lot of people are getting that news content in some opinion. That's not so surprising, or humor-based content. And that's actually not too surprising too when I really think about it, because between the memes and the GIFs and the clips from like late night talk show hosts, The Daily Show, that sort of thing, I know that I am getting a lot of world events and current events from humor-based content. But I think it's pretty interesting to think about how our media tastes have changed and the way that we are becoming informed. That I like to call it like the recipe for how we're informed is very different from generations previous. I mentioned this already, but news influencers, as a lot of people are referring to them, some people will call them content creators, independent creators. They are an increasingly popular type of media creator, and particularly in the news space, and especially for younger folks under 30, but certainly this is true for all age groups. A lot of people are looking at independent content creators for information across a variety of topics. And many of them are very good at what they do and have a lot of expertise, but also some of them aren't. So here's just kind of like a screenshot of a collection of creators who focus on science and medicine and health. And this is, of course, can be a very fraught space because we all experience health in our lives and we want to optimize for good health. And there is evidence in science and there's a wide range of information out there. And so it's very difficult sometimes to parse whether the person who I'm connecting with on a personal level, because they're engaging and they maybe look a certain way or sound a certain way, or they make me laugh, they are sharing content that I'm going to use for something serious like my health. It can be difficult to know whether that information is the best information for me. And I'm here to tell you that I think we should open up the world of content creation to as many people as possible. But it's just an important thing to remember that we need to assess sort of every individual as on their own in terms of the content that they provide for us to make sure that we are as informed with the best evidence as possible. So this all kind of underscores what I think and talk about a lot in my academic research, which is that media is an increasingly complex system and it's a dynamic system. And so this chart of sort of nodes and points is just kind of to show that both at the individual level, but in the groups that we affiliate with, we are influenced by and exert influence on the kind of content that we consume through a number of things. We're influenced by who's creating and who's sharing the information, what platform it's coming from, what personal beliefs we bring to this content creation or content consumption. And these are dynamic systems. So this isn't all happening at the same time, or sometimes it is happening on top of one another, and it doesn't always happen in the same way. So for health information, for instance, perhaps there's a certain group of people we like to listen to or a platform of choice we have for that type of information. And we might believe it in a certain way that if it were on a different platform, we would believe it differently. And there are a lot of different reasons for that, which I'll take a very high view of right now in the next couple of slides. But just want to make the point that certainly we don't live in a communication world where there's a sender, sending a message to a receiver in this like linear fashion. This is all sort of happening at us all at once. So the first little bit to think about for information, and I know part of what we're talking about today is misinformation, but I want to just point to that I'm not going to make that distinction in a lot of this today because we react to all information sort of cognitively and emotionally in the same way, regardless of whether it's true or false. And so there's sometimes not a lot of utility in sort of separating out misinformation from information. And so I'm just going to kind of speak to all information in sort of the same way, and to point out that information has value, it's useful. And because we live in a world where we can find the answer to any question, with an internet search or, a question to our favorite chatbot, we have gotten very used to being able to do this, like, ask this question. Siri, hey, tell me this, or Alexa, tell me this, or what's the answer to this? And we feel very confident that we're going to get an answer. Whether it's the best answer or the quote unquote right answer is a different story. But the point is that we are often seeking out information because it needs to fill a void or serve a purpose. I need to know what the weather's going to be like so I can dress appropriately for work. That's, how information is useful to me in a very tangible way. And I seek that information to fill that need, not necessarily because I'm looking for the truth. I'm looking to fill a need. And particularly with really thorny, wicked problems where there isn't a simple answer or a simple solution, we might choose the answer that's not the best because someone who maybe isn't giving us the best evidence can give us a simple answer to a complex problem, which helps fill that need in a way that a more complex answer doesn't. So I want to point out that I believe very strongly that most people are not choosing information that is bad for them on purpose. And when I say bad for them, I mean that it's not the best evidence, that it's false or it's misleading or it's not what's consensus. Most people are not actively choosing that because they want to believe the wrong thing. It is more likely because of certain cognitive biases that they hold and because they want this and because a certain narrative or set of information is useful to them. We do seek information that affirms our pre-existing beliefs. We like our brains to be in stasis mode and we like to feel comfortable. We don't want dissonance that's caused by being confronted with information that's different from what we believe. And that's a big motivator for choosing certain information across all types of ways that you can think of people, politically, demographically, whatever it is. These are it's how our brains work. And so again, I don't like to think of people as falling for misinformation or being victims of misinformation. It's more about thinking about why certain information is valuable and gets taken up by people at a certain point. Another thing that happens in these complex systems, which I already mentioned, is that influence or popularity, the being able to identify with someone who's creating content or sharing information sort of on a more personal level, can force us to conflate or cause us to conflate influence with expertise. So we might look at someone who is very persuasive online, sharing some information, and assume that they are an expert, a professional expert, a trained expert, whatever that might mean. But that's not always the case. And so these are sort of sometimes competing, sometimes like synergistic ideas, but they are different ideas. And it's important to remember that people aren't always just choosing the trained expert these days. Also important to know that information is very sticky. So because we're just overwhelmed with information kind of constantly as a course of life, we resort to mental heuristics or shortcuts that help us lighten this mental load. This is what Kahneman refers to as type 1, type 2 processing. We either use the fast automatic processing, which is using these mental shortcuts to help us filter out all the noise that we're experiencing, or type 2, which is the slow, effortful, sort of critical thinking that we hear so much about. We really want our brains to be slow and effortful as often as possible, but it's really just not possible to live in that space all the time. So being aware that our brains are creating shortcuts for us so that we can just like get through the day, get through our email. It's an important thing to understand. And that things like repetition are useful heuristics. The more we hear something, the more likely we are to remember it. It's important as a content creator and as an advocate to remember that it's difficult to update old information. So once you've got that sort of locked into your mental file cabinet, a certain fact or a certain idea, and it's been repeated enough times, even when you're confronted with new information, and even when that new information is compelling, it still can be difficult for us to update that filing cabinet with the new information. So it's very sticky in that way. And also, kind of related to that, emotional language has more power than facts and bullet points and figures in almost every case. I don't think I need to explain that, but it's important to note that we really are moved by narratives that make us feel certain things, and they are much more likely to go into the mental filing cabinet if we can attach a feeling to them. And this is part of why storytelling is an especially effective tool. And so Piper mentioned that at the beginning, and offering classes in Storytelling 101 is so important, because I think sometimes we think of storytelling in emotional language as being subversive or being used as a way to manipulate. But stories are really a fantastic way to connect, the best way to connect, because those that narrative form is so familiar. And so when we can learn to use that emotional language in positive ways that bring people together, it's a really, really powerful tool. So again, as I said before, there's a lot of reasons why people choose certain narratives or ideas that maybe aren't based in fact, that might be considered misinformation. And that has to do with a fragmented media audience, our pre-existing beliefs, the relationships we have, and all kinds of historical and cultural contexts that can lead to certain adoption of narratives and for them to gain traction. And it doesn't help when we live in a low trust environment where people view certain institutions, and in particular, the institutions of government and media, as not trusting, as polarizing forces. And oftentimes people see those two institutions, government and media, sort of working together, or maybe at odds, but having a multiplier effect of polarizing force. This further erodes trust, not only in those institutions, but in other democratic institutions, like one that I am a member of, another one I'm a member of, which is higher education. It also erodes trust in those expert voices. So those official voices that get attached to certain institutions. When there is low trust there, it means there's also low trust in those expert voices. So this is a survey that Edelman does every year called the Trust Barometer. I find it to be very insightful. It's a global survey, so these are results from 26 countries around the world. But we can see from the 2025 survey that there is a pervasive fear, very strong fear, that leaders lie to us actively, that they're purposely misleading us. And these are leaders across different institutions. So you can see on the graph, we're looking at government and media, but also business. And so we kind of operate in this place where we think that those experts and those institutions that ostensibly are here to serve us and to be for the public good are actually not doing that. And so some of the ways that have some of the resources that have come up in the ways of fighting this idea of active lying from important people, of course, are fact-checking operations like the International Fact-Checking Network, factcheck.org. These are just a couple of examples. Journalist Resource out of the Harvard Kennedy School I find to be really interesting, because it surfaces academic research and makes it more palatable for general audiences. So its purpose is to connect research to journalists, but this works for, I think, any storyteller. It's a great resource. And then this verification handbook, there's a couple of editions. I've used it in misinformation classes for years, edited by Craig Silverman, who also recently just started his own newsletter with Alexia Smentsalis, that looks at different ways that misinformation is still pervading, especially our social media. Fact checking has been seen as like the primary way to fight misinformation, and fact checking those leaders who we think maybe are not always being truthful. This is one tactic that continues to be very popular. But it's also shown that fact checking doesn't work on everybody. It's not an all-inclusive solution. Fact checking usually works on the people who are skeptical of misinformation, already skeptical of a narrative, and not necessarily someone who strongly believes in a narrative. So I don't have a lot of examples of misinformation today because, again, I kind of want to make the point that we want to move past sort of debunking misinformation because I just don't think for the average person that's a great use of their time, particularly folks in advocacy space. Yes, you want to make sure that you're setting the record straight, but spending all of your resources just fact checking every bit of misinformation, I think is not, in my opinion, not always the best use of resources. But I did want to share a couple of recent examples of the type of misinformation that even as things change and we've seen our social media platforms go all in on content moderation and then pull drastically back on content moderation and labeling types of content. The things we're still seeing and seeing in some cases more are uses of generative AI. So this summer, there was some spoofed Gen AI created audio that was used to impersonate our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and that confused folks, kind of higher level folks within his organization, to believe that was actually him making calls. So I think we're going to see a lot of those kinds of spoof calls, particularly of public figures and government leaders, to be one of the leading strands of misinformation. And then another form of misinformation that continues to persist, of course, is things related to disaster and conflict. So a lot of new and old tricks where it's Gen AI created images of the LA wildfires, as in this example, or another one that's useful, that's used a lot, is actually taking old footage of other natural disasters or global conflict and using them in new events. So at this point, I feel like the misinformation playbook is pretty well documented and out there, and we've all seen so many examples of it that we know what we're looking for. And that's why many of you, or most of you, said that you were pretty darn confident about what it is. You know it when you see it, and I'm sure you probably do. So I think what's different is that there has been a movement both in research and certainly, I think, again, in social media, away from let's try to rid our lives of this misinformation by debunking it or fact checking it, and instead let's try to figure out how to overcome it, build our own personal resilience, but flood the zone, as they say, with content that's going to negate the misinformation. So some tools that are helpful with, I guess, surfacing the good content. I say good, that's kind of a loaded term, but the evidence-based content or the least likely to be biased content. There are a lot of organizations that have come up in the last 10 years that serve to help us identify media bias and credibility. And I want to be clear that media bias and misinformation are not necessarily always the same thing. Sometimes they are, sometimes they overlap. But a news outlet that's biased or a creator that has a bias does not necessarily peddle misinformation. They peddle a point of view. But organizations like NewsGuard, one that has gained in popularity in recent years is Ground News, which is a news aggregator that allows us to see what types of news outlets are covering a certain story, whether they're outlets that tend to lean left or tend to lean right. And it has a feature called Blind Spot, which allows you, if you lean one way or the other, you fear you might have a blind spot in the news, you can look at topics that might be in that blind spot to make sure that you're getting a well-rounded view of the news. So I've heard in recent talks I've done over the last couple of years, a lot more people are using Ground News. There's also All Sides, which is a very similar organization which seeks to rate news organizations on credibility and bias. That's what NewsGuard does as well. I didn't mention that, but helps us situate our media diet in terms of where it aligns politically, which again is just one aspect of the information that we are consuming. But it's helpful for people because I think that overcoming bias is certainly that's something I get asked a lot. And then there's the Adfontes Media bias chart, which has been going for quite a long time, which charts in one place a lot of different news outlets and creators based on different criteria. So each one of these organizations has slightly different, but pretty similar criteria. And I think that they can be very useful tools to help us understand where our information is coming from. But again, like fact checking, I think this is but one part of the process of building a healthy media diet. Another important part, which is sort of the action piece I want to spend my last 10 minutes or so talking about, is how we as advocates, as creators, as storytellers can help move the needle on a low trust, bad information environment. And this is, I think, positive information that came from that same Edelman Trust Barometer survey from this year, which is that people kind of pretty overwhelmingly believe that influence is gained through compassion, not power. And so they want people to understand they want creators and people in power to understand what our needs and wants are, and that's the path to legitimate influence. And I think there is a direct tie between these feelings of needing to have our needs met and to be heard, and the importance and increased influence of independent creators, because if they don't actually address our needs individually, it often seems pretty much like they are. And again, we can develop these sort of parasocial relationships where it feels like they understand us and we understand them. And that is a more compelling path to influence than occupying a formal position of power. And that resonates with some research, or that matches up to some research that I did with some colleagues in 2023 when we asked people why they trust their healthcare providers or not, and why they trust local journalists or national journalists or not. And what we found is that trust building is a cycle, and it is as important to have professional expertise, whatever that may be, whatever that might mean, in your particular field, and engagement with the community that you're serving. So expertise without the engagement is not likely to build trust, in the same way with just engaging with folks, but not knowing what you're talking about, or not knowing how to meet people's needs or fill those voids, is also not going to do the trick. And so that combination of knowing what you know and being confident about what you know and your expertise, and engaging with folks to help them reach whatever goal they need to reach is going to be the key to building trust. So how can we manage our own media habits with good media literacy practices? And so one thing I want to make the point of now, which I probably should have made earlier, but just a reminder, it's very resonant in the media, in the world today. Media companies are cultural influencers, and they are businesses. Even independent creators are businesses, because we all need to figure out how to sustain ourselves monetarily to live in this world. And so these are businesses, and they have business imperatives. Media companies also are huge cultural influencers. They shape how we think and act, what we buy, but they're also shaped by us and by society as well. So especially as media continues to be consolidated, and at a national level, much of our media is owned by a very, very small select group of people. We need to remember that always, that's the frame from which our information is coming. It's important, of course, to diversify our sources of information. You could use that blind spot from ground news if that's helpful. Seek out other points of view actively, and try to avoid being siloed in your own groups, but also by the algorithms. Be aware of your emotions, intentions, and biases, and those in the media that you're consuming. And really avoid breaking news rabbit holes. I have to say, nothing good comes from following a breaking news event, unless you need to for your job. If it's important to your community, that's a different story. But if this is just a matter of like that need to be in the know, false information thrives in the absence of evidence, and there is always an absence of evidence in a breaking news hole. Take a step back and wait. Please wait. And then how can we use media literacy tips and use what we know about good media habits for public good in our advocacy work and our storytelling work in our communities? First things first, you have to know how your community gets their media. Who do they turn to for critical information, and what barriers are they facing getting the information that they need? Ask curious, open-minded questions, back up your ideas with reason, logic, and evidence, and engage in those conversations as open as you can. Emphasize cooperation. So often we think of things in terms of how things are polarizing us, but so many things, and I agree in my heart of hearts that more things bring us together than divide us. So in your storytelling, emphasize those places where we do cooperate, we have shared values, and we are willing to listen to other people's points of view. Tell your own story, and that can be your personal story. That can be the story of your organization, the story of a movement, the story of some change you wish to see. But importantly, make sure it's clear, relatable, and accessible. And as I was saying before, you want to repeat it often and as in many places as you can, so that people remember those powerful stories. Build a resource library of the best evidence available related to whatever your area of expertise of advocacy is so that you can be a consistent and reliable source of that information. Know that why misinformation spreads so fast in part is because it doesn't need any backup facts. You don't need to link out to other things. You don't need to prove that it's correct. Building evidence takes time. Creating lies does not. So build that resource library and have it on hand to be a consistent, reliable source of information, even if that's just to one person. You don't have to be a TikTok superstar to make a difference. And to that note, make sure you have a high tech and a low tech strategy for sharing that evidence-based information or those stories that you wish to share. Never more important than now to say don't rely on third-party platforms that you don't control to spread your message. We don't control any of these platforms that we operate on at all, really, at this point. And we are seeing lots of reasons and evidence of how that can come back to harm us. So a low-tech strategy, like, I don't know, flyers on a pole in your neighborhood, or just good old-fashioned chatting to people in person, is a really important part of that strategy. And know who your community's trusted messengers are, so you can work with them and activate them in times of need. You can't build those relationships overnight, so this is an important long-term goal. And you can't build those relationships in the most critical times of need. So you got to start now. And I think that's it. I think that's all I want to say for now. I'll stop sharing, and I can't wait to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Christy. My mind is going 1,000 miles an hour, which I'll take your reminder that we need some slow thinking as well. And I encourage everybody, as you have questions, please put those in the Q&A. I'll say that that last one on my mind goes to Andor. I hope folks have had a chance to see that. It is a fascinating prequel to all prequel maybe, but the notion of not trusting technology that you don't fully control. If you've seen that, you may remember a key line in there. But your notion of slow and effortful thinking and then talking also about recipes for news consumption made me think of something that I heard just yesterday when someone was giving advice on how we can consume news now at an era where things are getting faster and faster. And they said, think about consuming it as your grandparents did, which is to take your cup of coffee or tea, sit down and read, or maybe you're watching or listening, but have it be a time in your day rather than the constant updates that are just, flooding us all the time. But I'm curious, is that realistic? What are your thoughts?
That is like such a classic practice. I don't practice what I preach. I try really hard. I think it's very aspirational for most people at this point. I don't, this is not scientific evidence, so don't quote me on this, but I mean, I do think, speaking for myself, that my attention span is noticeably different than it once was. And I have to actively combat that in order to take time for anything, whether it's the news or it's reading a book or it's just being alone with my thoughts. Our brains, I think, have sped up. Again, this is not scientifically proven that I know of. That's not my area of research, but it does feel like my brain is sped up to a speed that it's hard to control that. And so intention is really important. And I think in the way that people find intention in meditation or other ways that they slow down, we could aspire to that in our information consumption as well. My former colleague and mentor, Dan Gilmore, always used to liken it to, the slow food movement, which is like, he would call it the slow news movement. So in the same way that we want to take care with our food, or again, with our, whatever it is, we should be doing that with information as well. I don't think it is realistic, honestly. We're not gonna that shit like the ship has sailed in terms of like everyone slowing down. So I think the best we can do is try to make it a priority for ourselves and modeling that, right? Modeling that for others.
Yeah, and I appreciate Pam's comment in the chat about your good advice and waiting for clear information when reading breaking news. And I think that that's so important. We've seen that recently in so many examples, just jumping into making assumptions, and it's not helpful. If you're the person in the middle of it and you need urgent information, that's one thing. But I think that there's more space than we may think in this 24/7 cycle.
There
So
always is. There always is. And that is one area I've gotten much better at is as soon as something major happens, I'm like, okay, I am tuning out. I do not have the capacity to follow this so closely where I used to absolutely watch everything, you know? So
yeah. Well, and I want to be mindful too for folks, especially if you're in a communications role in advocacy, there may be times that people do need to be following all the news. And again, if folks have questions, if that applies to you in your role, we'd love to hear from you in the Q&A. But there are times where we need to be right on top of things. But if that's not a rule, if we've got that space, I think considering giving ourselves that space to process a bit more can be helpful. And I'm curious, I really struck me when you're talking about like the ability to identify with a person where there's that relatability. And I hear you where our minds are just naturally, as humans, like, oh, I identify with this person, so I'm more likely to trust them, which is really dangerous. If somebody, I've got, and you mentioned compassion, like I've got compassion for days, but you should not be getting your weather advice from me. You should not be getting your medical advice from me. And I know that you host an entire series on reimagining expertise, which gets into this issue of relatability. What do you want people to know when it comes to inadvertently prioritizing relatability over expertise, especially for those of us who work in advocacy organizations where we do have that expertise and we need people to be listening to the recommendations, the reports, the research that we've created?
yeah. Well, there's a couple of things, and I'm really excited about this series because there's so much I don't know, and it's definitely a new line of research for me. But I think as a creator of information, it's important to know your limits. And so being good about saying, just like as you just said, this is what I know about, this is my lane, this is how I can connect you to people to know about this thing. Again, sort of being open and honest about your own limitations of your own expertise, right? Can actually improve relatability. I think most people find, humility in that way a trusting, like an attribute of a trustworthy person. On the consumption side of things, I think it's sort of a little bit the same thing. Somebody who seems to have all the answers to something can seem pretty great at times, especially if their delivery is compelling. But being a generalist is great, but if you really need specific information, you need a specialist. And so I don't think it's harmful, generally speaking, to be around these sort of generalists and picking and cherry picking what you're going to adopt. But know what matters to you and know what is like a critical need. And when it's a critical need, look to the specialist because that's the person that's going to provide you the best evidence in that moment. And that's the same thing with the slow, effortful thinking. You're not going to do it all the time, but you should make sure you do it with the things that are critical to you. It's going to be
Mhm.
different for everybody. But there's a lot of snake oil salesmen out there. Always has been, always will be. And they use the same tricks as they did when they had wagons and like rode into town, in the 19th century. So
Yeah, well, and I'm thinking too for, it could be some advice for our experts. And I say this, some folks may know I'm a recovering lawyer, and I remember, right after graduation from law school, it would just part of the education, we felt like, well, now I have to use these big words all the time, and everything was tortious. And I look back on that and I sort of cringe. And then I think as you get more comfortable in your profession, you can start talking hopefully like a real human again. And I think having that relatability alongside expertise is a powerful combination. And we know nobody wants to be talked down to. And so finding that balance in our advocacy of having knowledge, and I really, of course, I appreciate your nod to the power of stories, but, having the story to come along with it. Here's something that can be more relatable, and curious if you've got, what would you say to folks who are, experts in their field, and really, just so passionate about the advocacy, wanting to change something, like what more should they keep in mind?
Yeah, that's great. And I think that you're absolutely right that like we have a lot to learn from these creators who are so very relatable. And I mean, even as an expert in media, like I love a lot of my creators, but I have I think a healthy distance or a healthy awareness of when I've developed, maybe a parasocial relationship with someone where I'm like, oh, I love this guy. But I know that it's not, I can keep it at arm's length because I have that expertise. But there's a lot to be learned from being more relatable and being the smart. I've always said to my students, you never want to be the smartest person in the room. That means you have nothing more to learn and that you're not
Mhm.
curious and you're not open to what other people bring to the table. I think a lot of times experts, they're how they identify themselves, right? And so it can feel nerve-wracking to let that go and sort of like be among the common people, but then you're not relatable. And in particularly if you're in advocacy work, like how would you ever move anyone without relating to how they feel and like again building a sense of cooperation. So I think there's a lot to learn from speaking plainly and speaking from the heart and speaking persuasively in that way while still heralding that expert knowledge and evidence that you have and being a translator, right? Advocates have to be translators in a lot of ways of that like expert knowledge that does exist in behind paywalls and with specialized language and jargon to what you're trying to achieve. So I think those are good things to keep in mind.
There are two resources I'd love to add to the recording that we'll send everybody, and then also in the YouTube description, where one comes actually from Nashville, where there were folks who were advocating to change a school start time to be later and more consistent with the science. We know that young kids, especially teens, need extra sleep, so starting school really early in the morning is unhelpful for everybody, including everybody who has to get them up and going. And one of the lessons they learned was that leaning on the science was just not enough. Exactly as you're saying, understanding people's concerns, having that connection and understanding first, and then bringing in the here's what the science says. We can advocate with that, and it just there's a lot to be learned there. So thank you for highlighting that. And the other thing I'd love to add with all the resources, and thank you for all you've mentioned for how can we combat misinformation, how do we cut through. There's a new, I think it's new. I just learned about it actually yesterday from the National Civic League, or I'm sorry, the Civic Health Project, called Normsy. Is that something that you
New to me.
Normsy.ai, and it's a way to generate posts that push back on misinformation on social media. So we'll include that in the resources as well. But I wanted to share some good news this Friday that there's a lot of tools coming out that are recognizing the challenges in misinformation and hopefully rising to meet them. So
That's great.
yeah. And so, okay, again, folks, I can ask questions all day, but if there's a reason that you came to this webinar, I'm curious your questions, the things you'd like to get out of that. So pop that into the Q&A. In the meantime, I would love to hear, are there other resources, Christy, that come to mind when you think about folks who are advocating, who are wanting to cut through all of the noise and reach people? What other resources would you recommend for them?
Gosh, I mean, and that's the thing is like it can feel resources can feel as overwhelming as the media landscape. And so I think what I advocate for more than resources, although there are plenty great ones, is to think about your media use as a practice. Like I think I've gotten to the point and been doing this for long enough to where it's like everyone back to the idea of a recipe. Like at this point, it's just everyone has their own recipe for how they become informed and who's going to inform them and what matters most to them. And it's not, defined by the pages of their daily newspaper or the 30-minute broadcast. It's defined by whatever it's defined by. And it's impossible to keep track of that as a advocate or a professional or whatever. So I think thinking about building practices that bring more intention to your media use holistically is the best advice that I can give. And what tools you're going to use to do that will depend on what your recipe is. And if that means, ditching social media or taking a social media break or relying only on, Apple News as an aggregator of information or whatever is going to work for you, I think it's important to develop those habits to eschew the chaos and eschew this idea that we have to live in the chaos. I think that that is like the most
Mhm.
important thing I want people to remember is that we don't have to live in the chaos. And again, I say this as someone who doesn't always practice what they preach because the chaos is very compelling. But we can opt out in little ways and big ways. And sometimes opting out is just the best resource that there is.
I love that. And I do the same sometimes. Here's my advice, take it. I'm not using it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do things like I delete the apps off my phone as an
Mhm.
example, because if they're not on my phone, then I can't just do it. It's harder. It's a lot harder to use Instagram on a computer than it is to use, a lot harder. And that's by design. So from the app. So if you don't have the app, it's not there's so much more friction to using Instagram on your laptop than it is to using it on your phone. It makes it much less fun. And if and I'll go through cycles. I'll delete it from my phone for a few months and then something will happen. I'll put it back on. And so anyway, the just these practices and being mindful with them, I think is just where my head is right now.
I love that. I love that. The intentionality and thinking about the platform, ease of use, all the things that can be invisible
Yes.
by design to keep
Mhm.
us on them. So thank you for that. And seeing appreciation here and a question, great to hear from you. And we've got a question. How can communicators, once distrusted in media and perhaps even in their outlet, or sorry, let me read this before I start reading it aloud, but how can communicators, once distrust in media and perhaps even in their particular outlet has been built, how can they address that distrust and then work towards shifting it? Thank you for that question.
It is a great question, and it's difficult to do. And I think part of this depends on, how big is your organization? How bad was the breach of trust? Is this like a singular event or something over time? So there's probably different answers to that. But I think one thing I would say is that being as transparent as possible about your processes is a research-backed way to give yourself some credibility. The trust building might take longer, but you can rebuild the credibility in your content by being open about how you came to produce the content. And that's everything from your sourcing to your editing process to your process for correcting information. We did some research on corrections specifically and found that if a major news organization had a big mistake and made a correction, the trust was broken or it was harmed. But owning up to the correction restored credibility. The trust follows later, because trust is like, I don't know, it feels more personal. But I think transparency in general is a really important way, and consistency. Obviously striving for accuracy and meeting your audience where they are, addressing their needs is important, and being transparent about all of those processes.
Fabulous. All right, we've got a comment and then another question here. I'm really appreciating the person who wrote 100% that no misinformation gets by, said that was a bit tongue in cheek. A retired fellow professor who taught media literacy for years says that you covered my main strategies. One, don't trust or repeat breaking news. Wait for verification. Have a repository of sources that you can refer to about facts and history. Yes, to our history and understanding and knowing it. Use a news aggregator. He uses Flipboard and always double and triple check the sources. So thank you for that input.
Those are all excellent pieces of advice for sure.
And a question we've got here is someone would love to hear you talk more about how to effectively persuade people who have deeply held beliefs that aren't fact-based, but do have a deep emotional pull. And this is an important example here in gun violence prevention work. We run up against the belief that having a gun in the home makes you safer when the research shows the opposite is true. Thank you for that question.
That is tough. And I'm not an expert on gun violence and gun safety, so I don't want to overstep. But I think that the best answer I can provide is in an emotionally heated topic such as that, emphasizing the cooperation, the shared values, is probably the best that you can do. Because behavior changes. So it's one thing to change your belief, but to change your behavior is yet another thing. And these are they're sometimes tied together, but not always. And so you could maybe even convince somebody that that data that they believe about having a gun in the home is not correct. But will they change their behavior is an entirely different story. Um, and I guess I wonder what you want the communication to do. Do you want the communication to change the belief or to change the behavior? And those are questions you would need to ask for yourself in order to craft messages to design for those outcomes. I know I'm not answering the question. I'm kind of dancing around it because it is so hard. And sometimes you're not going to be successful. And I don't wish to say you shouldn't change your goal, because I don't mean that at all. But for some people, those will be intractable points. And I don't love the idea of just dismissing a group of people because that piece is intractable, but rather what piece would not be intractable and where can you find commonality? Because if you can find an opening with some other argument that maybe doesn't change that behavior, but opens the door to a possibility of a different point of view, that is a success for folks who are very far on a fringe of very far to one way or the other on a topic. And I think sometimes it's baby steps, right? Opening that door a little bit more, a little bit more. I feel like that's a very unsatisfactory answer, and I'm sorry.
You've
But
touched on so many different points in there, and I'm reminded actually of our most recent webinar about translating from blue to red, to use the political big umbrella terms. And I think that a lot of times that reliance on data, if we over rely on data, you can forget the importance of having people feel heard. And I love in the question you're saying these are deeply held, like there's the beliefs and the emotions, and our emotions aren't factual. Sometimes our emotions are based on all the things that have shaped to where we are today. And so really recognizing, I think there's so much wisdom in that question. And so starting with where people are, and I love what you're saying about, is this behavior or beliefs, really being intentional about that, and then thinking through our advocacy framework, who's the best messenger for this? And if it's somebody who's, again, I'm going to be picking on all the experts sometimes, if you're, really wonky and coming out with the data versus someone who's like, hey, it sounds like that. I'm taking many words to say it's that combination of the relatability and the information. So yeah.
yeah, it is a pretty powerful combination, as simple as it seems, and as common sense, and as much as we're probably already doing that, like intuitively. Well, actually, you'd be surprised how many people aren't doing that intuitively. So yeah, that's it. I think that's a great thing to aspire to.
Yeah, because we get so passionate in our advocacy and things are moving so quickly that sometimes we don't take that time to slow down. So I do want to take just a moment. I know we're right on the hour, so if folks need to drop off, thank you for joining. But if I can ask one more question, Christy, with all we've covered, what is the one thing that you'd like people to take away from today?
I think I'd like people to take away for this group in particular, because we are talking about advocacy and story, just how important it is, what an important tool story and connection can be. Again, I think so much of what we are steeped in right now is negativity and division, and that's a frame, right? I mean, it's not to say that that's not also reality to a degree, but it is a frame that is being used to further divide. And I feel like the people on this call are probably in the business of bringing people together. And we can use our own stories and our own roles as media creators to help override the noise and the division. I have to believe that that's true. I do believe that that's true. And so I would say, again, intentional media consumption and use to build those bridges and think about cooperation. I hope that's like a hopeful, that's my hope.
Yeah,
My hope
I
for.
love it. I love it. And if I seem a bit buoyant today, it's because I'm actually sitting in a presidential library at the end of a summit, full of people who are dedicated to bridging our current divisions. And if that's ever anything that's of interest, let me know. That's beyond the scope of this webinar, but there's a lot of good work, including all the work that you're doing, Christy, and educating this next generation of people who are consuming media, and our literacy right now is just more important than ever. So thank you so much for all the wisdom that you've shared today. And thank you everyone for joining. You can learn more about Christy's work. We'll put some information in the chat there. This is, as always, an ongoing series. Next month, we will be talking about AI and communications for social good. So really looking forward to that conversation and hope that you can join us. Again, we've got two courses next month: Storytelling 101, Ethical Storytelling. We'll put a code in the chat. Webinar will save you $25 on registration. As you drop off, there will be a poll pop up, 15 seconds. We'd love your time and hear your feedback. Be well, do good, stay healthy and hopeful, and we will see you in October.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.